Massimo, it's good to see you again.
As usual, it's good to see you.
Now, we are working with a few caveats. So Massimo, despite the fact that he's in paradise, has managed to catch a slight cold. So
Right.
we're going to work within those constraints. And Massimo's also recording with a new iPad, which explains the angle at
Right.
which we're seeing him. Although he looks good from every angle, so it's
Thanks.
fortunately for him. I have to prop myself up, or else I look like a beached whale. Um, Massimo, today we're going to start talking about your book, and this is really an unusual thing you've done. You've taken what is essentially an academic book, although it was intended to have some crossover
Right.
appeal for a popular audience, and you've decided to publish it serially.
Yes.
So you and Dickens.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
should I not make you laugh? Is it gonna? Is it gonna? But so you've been, and this is, I'm realizing now we're now in how many months are you into this now?
That's been a couple of months now, and we're almost done actually, because there's only another 4 or 5 installments to come out, and
Okay,
then we're gonna be done.
this was a serious undertaking, and I don't even want to know how hard it was to cut it up into these pieces and to sort of to. But it's really amazing. I don't know that I've seen such a detailed, long form thing published over such a long period of time. So we're gonna do a few shows on this. I think probably if we do three, we can probably cover most of the really interesting stuff.
Yeah, that sounds.
Um, and so today we'll get started. Now, the book is called. The title of the book is "The Nature of Philosophy: How Philosophy Makes Progress and Why It Matters." And the You do talk a lot in the book about what philosophy is, but it seems to me that the secondary title is more than a secondary title. You really are interested in the question of how philosophy makes progress.
Right.
Um, Maybe you could talk a little bit just for a minute, just to motivate these things. What, aside from your independent interest in this question, what particularly moved you to talk about to write a book about philosophy and how it progresses?
Oh, that's easy. That's, as you know, I moved to philosophy full time over the last few years after a career as a biologist, as a scientist. And I moved to it without having to recall my life story, but I moved to it because I wanted something different to do, and I always been interested and intrigued by philosophy. And so I said, whatever. I had the opportunity to do it, so it worked out. And the first thing that struck me as very weird was two observations, which were immediately apparent over the first few months that I started serving in a philosophy department. One was that a significant number of scientists had what can be only described as contempt for philosophy. Now, I don't know, and maybe we'll get into this later. I don't know the statistics. I don't think there are statistics out there, so it's probably unfair to say that the majority of scientists or a great number of scientists, but certainly a good number of contemporary high-profile scientists, especially physicists. And this also wasn't always the case because there was a time at the early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, where both in biology and physics, philosophy was held in high esteem. So this is actually a late 20th century, early 21st century phenomenon, and it is typical of only, as far as I know, it's representative only of a mostly physics. But nonetheless, it struck me as very weird. And the second thing that I observed, which was even more weird, is a number of philosophers joining into the fracas and basically shooting themselves in the foot by, not just criticizing their own field, which is fine. That's actually a sign of a healthy, intellectual environment. But dismissing it, or basically saying, well, yeah, we should just close this whole thing and move to the sciences. So those two things struck me from the beginning. I've now been officially a philosopher, meaning that my paycheck comes from a philosophy department for more than 7 years, or for a little more than 7 years, which is why, of course, I'm on sabbatical right now.
Yeah.
And in those years, is that thing is stuck with me, and it's at some point I said, since I have this unusual situation, sort of in terms of personal academic history, of actually having lived and worked within both sides of what CPs know famously called the two cultures, the academic
which we talked about,
right. Then I think, well, maybe I am actually uniquely, or if not uniquely, unusually qualified to make that sort of, to write this kind of book, basically, to write a book. In a sense, it is a defense.
Hold on, you're freezing a little bit.
Uh-oh.
No, it's okay now. Start again. It's certainly a defense. You were saying
it's a defense of philosophy, or even better, just an explanation of what philosophy is. In some sense, even to philosophers themselves, but mostly to outsiders, particularly across other academic fields.
So let me ask you just one more thing along these lines of motivation. So, you talked about attitudes within certain prominent members of the scientific community, especially very public members like Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Then you talked also about some of the attitudes within the philosophy departments themselves, which I certainly see, and we'll probably talk about later. But there's also a third thing, and that is that sort of the institutional jeopardy that philosophy seems to be in,
sure,
that you and I have discussed within the academy. And is there some sense in your part that you think that this also, I'm assuming that you think that all of these are the result of people not understanding the distinctive way in which philosophy makes progress, that's the relationship between the topic of progress and your motivations. Because you're not just writing about philosophy generically, you're writing specifically about the way in which philosophy progresses. Is it your impression that these negative attitudes and the institutional jeopardy philosophy finds itself in is partly due to not understanding the way in which philosophy progresses?
Yeah, and I'll tell you why. So as you know, philosophy is classed usually among the humanities, the humanistic disciplines.
Yes.
But it has always, I would maintain, been a little strange of a classification, because philosophy certainly does have, obvious humanistic components. I mean, some philosophy is basically literature, or literary criticism, or things like that. But since philosophy is also the mother of logic and the mother of science itself, it's very closely related also historically to mathematics. Think about the Pythagoreans, for instance.
Yeah.
Then it's kind of weird, because it really actually is literally, it does stride both areas. It's not just humanities. It's not quite a science. And I think that is why it's being singled out by the scientists, because you never hear Stephen Hawking say, "Oh well, we should never read Shakespeare because it's useless."
Right.
Granted, some academic deans do that kind of, say that kind of thing, actually. But that's just because they're a bunch of ignorants who do their own things in terms of sort of market economy, whatever the hell they think that it's good for the university. But you don't hear scientists say things like, forget about literature, or forget about,
don't read Susan Sontag on camp or something, right? I mean, they don't. Yeah.
So because they realize that there is value. They may not understand it, or they may understand it. I don't know, but there is value. I mean, I'm pretty sure that people like deGrasse Tyson and Weinberg and so on, and have read, Shakespeare or read literature.
Right. And have been to they go to art museums. They listen to operas.
They go to museums.
Right.
They go to concerts.
Yes.
Right. So nobody questions. Nobody within the academy. Except for those misguided deans and provosts that I mentioned ago, questions the value of the arts and the humanities per se. But the value of philosophy, yes, it's open field. And so I wondered, why is that? Why is it that we are not left alone, just like the musicians, the painters, the writers, and so on and so forth? And I suspect, by talking to fellow colleague scientists, that the reason is because we are literally seen as not doing either one of those things. Yeah. We're seen as wanting to ape the sciences, but not quite getting there. And at the same time, we're not really literature. So what the hell are we doing?
Right. And so there is a kind of an expectation that we fail to fulfill that they don't have of artists and paint. Because this is one of the things I'm going to want to talk to you a little bit about later. I mean, we talk about progress, and I'm going to ask you sort of to talk a little bit about how you define progress in the book and how you assign the different kinds of progress to the different disciplines. But along the lines of the logic of what we're talking about thus far, the idea, I guess, then is supposed to be that, well, the reason the scientists don't dismiss the arts is that they don't expect the arts to progress.
Correct.
Now, that's very weird to me because I think the arts definitely do progress. And so we should, when we get to talking about the different kinds of progress, maybe we'll get into that. But is that roughly what you're sort of saying? You're saying, look, the scientists have a very clear conception of progress. Philosophy doesn't fall under it, but philosophy also doesn't seem to be one of those things that they would exempt from it, right?
Exactly, that's right. Now that said, I'm actually not sure that the arts don't make progress. And in fact, at some point in an early incarnation of the book, which initially, by the way, the initial title for the book, the working title for the book was, Does Philosophy Make Progress? That it was much more explicit, and it was in terms of a question. Of course, it was meant to be as a rhetorical question, but nonetheless. But originally, one or two of the chapters actually dealt with other areas of the humanities. For instance, music or the visual arts. The problem, and then I eventually decided to drop that because, frankly, it's so far out of my expertise that, already, as we will talk about either today or in the next installments, already going out on my limb talking about, science, I know enough, I think. But talking about mathematics, the history of mathematics, the history of logic, that was already spreading myself as thin as I could feel comfortable with. I wouldn't feel comfortable going. I had read actually quite a bit. I prepared for that chapter on, based on the history, art history and literary criticism and all that. And I do think that actually, even since we're now talking informally in some part of the book, I do think that even in those fields, there is something analogous to a exploration of different ideas in sort of a kind of logical space or space of possibilities, if you like. I don't want to call it logical space because that sounds too formal, but a space of possibility. So my favorite example, which I have a couple of musician friends and they tell me that this way of looking at it makes sense. My favorite example is jazz, the history of jazz. If you look at jazz from its roots in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, it explored a number of different ways. Musicians explored a number of different ways of doing jazz, which became progressively more freeform, more independent of sort of the original rhythms and roots of the genre. And now they seem to have and by now I mean the last 20 years maybe or so or more. They sort of seem to have at least temporarily exhausted that search, and so now we see actually going back to earlier forms or doing some kind of mixing of different things, of different eras of jazz. So that to me suggests, but I'm not enough of a expert in musical theory to actually unequivocally state that even in music and similarly in art. I mean, think about the progression from the invention of perspective, for instance, during the Renaissance. I mean, that's progress. If you think about in the visual arts,
right.
That is definitely a revolution that constitutes the introduction of a new idea and the exploration of new territories, right? But now what have we got? We got by the 20th century first to minimalist art, and then to completely abstract art, increasingly abstract, and then completely abstract art. The famous gray number 25, gray number 26, and so on and so forth. Well, that to me, again, and then we're seeing now going back to sort of, if not classical, certainly a variety of different approaches to the visual arts. So that to me suggests a similar thing, that there is progress in some kind of conceptual space, but it is so far out of my expertise that I'd just rather not get into it in the book.
All right, so the reason I said that was because there was something in the first chapter which you said about fiction, which I thought was indicating that you were suggesting that arts don't progress. But let's not stop teasing people, and let's get right ahead and talk about what you mean by progress. I mean, in order to do what you want to do, you're going to have to tell us what philosophy is, which you spend a lot of time doing. And you're also going to have to give some notion of what you mean by progress, and then the two are going to have to sort of fit together. So let's talk first about what you mean by progress. So in the first chapter of the book, you do, in a sense, you do simply give us the common usages. You go to the dictionary,
Yep.
and which, as we know, simply records common usage, and you give the following two definitions of progress. The first is forward or onward movement towards a destination. And the second is advancement towards a better, more complete, or more modern condition. Okay.
Right.
And then you go on to assign these two notions of progress to different disciplines. So you basically say that the natural sciences progress in the manner of the first definition.
Good
Right,
estimation.
right. Forward
In
movement towards a
particular,
destination.
yeah, in particularly physics.
Okay.
Because actually one can, maybe we get into this, but maybe one can actually make a distinction. As you know, we do agree that there is an interesting distinction between fundamental physics and the so-called special sciences, which is basically everything else. So in the case of the special sciences, one can actually say that they may fall into either one or a combination of those definitions. But in the case of fundamental physics, the physicists themselves tell you that they are after a goal. They're after the, what they call the theory of everything, the final theory of everything. Now, what they mean by it and how they're going to get there, that's a different issue. But they clearly have a goal. They seem to have a very specific goal in mind, which is a fundamental understanding of all the laws of nature, where they're coming from, and why the universe is structured the way it is.
But is that? I mean, I don't want to get us too scattered by arguing each point as we go along. But I just want to be clarified. Is that not also true, let's say, of biology? I mean, isn't biology? I mean, the Genome Project, all this sort of stuff, isn't ultimately what biology is interested in? Is unlocking the secret of what life consists of, how it comes to be, all its manifestations.
Exactly, which is why I actually put initially, or in the book, I put all the natural sciences into that basket. But one can also argue that unlike fundamental physics, the rest of the sciences, including actually non-fundamental physics, including other areas of physics, are actually they're going after individual projects like the Human Genome Project or whatever it is. And you can say,
that's kind of a theory of everything for life, isn't it?
Well, yes.
Genetics, ultimately.
Right. And you can say that, that's an ultimate goal, sort of, understanding life in all its diversity. But in fact, in its origin and its diversity. But in fact, the more biology progresses, the more actually you see splintering of goals and expansion of different disciplines and sub-disciplines that sort of spin out of each other, right? So genetics didn't exist until the beginning of the 20th century, and then now it's a major component of what it means to be biology. But evolutionary biology, of course, was introduced by Darwin in the mid-19th century. Now it's its own huge branch. So one can argue both ways. One can say, but all of this is actually under the umbrella of understanding life. Fine. If you want to stay with that sort of general level of description, that's true. But it's also true historically, and this is, of course, Jerry Fodor's point about the special sciences, that they actually keep spinning out new and new stuff, and the more they progress, the more actually they divide themselves up into a bunch of other different things. So in that sense, one can equally reasonably, I think, say that biology, psychology, geology, and so on and so forth are actually in the business of increasing our understanding of whatever their subject matter is. In this case, in the case of biology, the living world, but they do so by expanding, not by focusing, not by narrowing everything down to a single equation, which is, on the other hand, the goal in fundamental physics.
Okay, so physics. So let's just, for the sake of tidiness, just let's not be so precise, and let's say, okay, the natural sciences roughly are going to fall under this first definition: forward or onward movement towards a destination. Right. With the understanding that maybe they also could be described as fulfilling the second definition. The second definition being advancements toward a better, more complete, or more modern condition, which you then assign to logic, mathematics, and ultimately will assign to philosophy. Right. And before you go on to do that, let me just ask you one more thing, and that is, I noticed that the social sciences are omitted from this sorting. Where did you imagine them? First of all, did you omit them on purpose? Are they going to play some role later? Or do you see them fitting into either of these, or do you think they don't fit into either of these, or where do the social sciences go in the map?
That's a great question. I left them out on purpose. And again, in the early version of the book, in the first draft of the book, there actually was a chapter on the social sciences, particularly focused on economics. But I dropped it for the same reason that I dropped the one on sort of the humanities more broadly construed, because I simply don't feel confident enough. I read a lot of stuff, but I don't feel confident enough to actually write in detail about that. So I left it out. But one thing that makes the social sciences a weird thing is that I think one can make a reasonable argument that they're actually a combination of humanities and social science, and natural sciences. This point was brought home to me by a colleague of mine at City College. Last semester, before going on sabbatical, I taught a new course on epistemology across the curriculum, where we looked at the epistemological aspects of different disciplines, all the way from the natural sciences to the social sciences to even the humanistic disciplines, right? And this colleague of mine came to give a talk to my class about basically sociology and sociological history, right? And he said explicitly, he said, we fancy ourselves, we think of ourselves as a science. We aim to be a natural science. We like to be a natural science. But at the same time, it is and he said, and I'm fine with that, meaning that we want to import all of the quantitative aspects, all of the modeling aspects, if possible, if they work, from the natural sciences. But at the same time, there is an irreducible human aspect to it, an aspect of narrative. He was giving the example, for instance, of colonialism, right? And he said, okay, you can describe colonialism, the phenomenon of colonialism, in terms of figures and numbers and facts, and in a very sort of third-person scientific way of doing things. But you're missing part of the picture. What are you missing? Well, you're missing the first-person account of people who lived either under or were actually on the other side of the colonialist divide. And he showed example after example. And he said, look, if you don't read biographies of these people, if you don't read what they had to say about it, you're just missing something fundamental to understand what colonialism was about. Yeah. Which to him meant that sociology in that sense, or sociological history, was actually this weird combination of natural sciences and humanities. And I bought, I think, at least provisionally, that kind of description, which meant that I left it out of the book, at least in part because that would complicate things even further. And as you know, the book is long as it is.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine, and I don't mind. I don't think there's anything wrong with dealing with a simplified domain of things. I just, for my own clarification, wanted to know how you saw that. So maybe talk a little bit about the way in which you see logic and mathematics, and let's leave philosophy out for a minute. How you see logic and mathematics fulfilling the second definition, advancements towards a better, more complete, or more modern condition.
Right. So there is that classification struck me initially. It was an intuitive thing. I mean, I looked at what mathematicians and logicians are doing. I'm more familiar with what logicians are doing than mathematicians because, of course, I'm in a philosophy department, so I talk to logicians. And I studied logic at the graduate level. I studied mathematics only at the undergraduate level. But I had colleagues, of course, in mathematics, and so we talk, and I read a few things. And so initially, when I started reading the book, I had this intuition that logic and mathematics were going to be closer on the spectrum of sort of different types of progress to what I think philosophy does than to the natural sciences. And then I started reading the actual literature, particularly on the history of both logic and mathematics, because the approach that I talk in the book, as you've seen, is in terms of logic and mathematics, is a historical one. I think that it makes sense if you're talking about progress to say, well, all right, these things started out with Pythagoras and Aristotle and things like that. So, and now here we are with Fermat's last theorem on the one hand, and multimodal logics and things like that. So how do we get here from there? And it turns out that there seems to be a pretty good agreement among mathematicians and especially historians of mathematics of how they got there. And there are very deep parallels between mathematics and logic. Maybe the first thing to do would be actually to talk about a little bit whether there is a distinction between the two or not, because some people, including some professionals, actually do think that mathematics is a kind of logic, or the other way around.
I thought that was sort of dropped when the Logicist program failed. In other words, the notion that you could reduce your mathematics to pure statements of mathematics to purely logical statements, I thought that was chucked after the Frege / Russell Whitehead program flopped.
Right, right. To some extent, that's true. Except that one of the articles that I mentioned in the chapter on the distinction between logic and mathematics, right at the beginning of that chapter, actually says, well, that depends on what you mean by logic. If by logic you mean the kind of very formal, strict approach that Frege and Russell and all that were using, then sure, of course, that project of reducing mathematics to logic is gone. It's done, and the final word there was Gödel's theorems. But you can also talk about logic in a sort of more informal way, as a particular type of reasoning about certain kinds of problems, in which case mathematics, one can make an argument, is a type of logic, not in the sense that it's reducible to it. I think it's more sensible to think of mathematics and logic as very closely allied disciplines, both of which use sort of symbology and formalism in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. And in both cases, what they want to accomplish is entirely independent of empirical evidence. It is, even though very likely, in fact, surely, mathematics and probably also logic did start out historically out of sort of empirical facts, right? I mean, we have a capability to count things, for instance, or to notice the shapes of different shapes of things from which geometry came from. I mean, there's no question that in historical terms, very early on, mathematics and probably logic were a way of dealing with practical problems, right? Like counting or dividing up geometrical shapes and things like that. But that very quickly was superseded by this ability of both fields to internally generate their own problems, which is why I think they're very different from science. Science's problems are posed from the outside. In the sense, on the one hand, they're trivially internally generated because it's scientists who decide what to work on.
Yeah.
But non-trivially, it is nature itself that poses the problem. Right? So there's such a thing as natural laws, or so we think. Well, where did they come from? There is such a thing as certain astronomical phenomena or certain biological phenomena. Well, those are problems that are posed from the outside. Those are not internal inventions of the field.
Right.
In the case of mathematics, there is no such thing as multidimensional solids or hyperplanes or Fermat's last theorems out there.
Yeah.
Right? Even if you're a Platonist, which I happen not to be, a mathematical Platonist, but even if you are a mathematical Platonist, they're not out there in the same sense in which empirical facts are out there.
Yeah.
Same goes for logic. It's not like when you start talking about fuzzy logic or deontic logic or dialectism, all these sort of things. Those are answers to internally generated problems. Let's take dialectism, which is this sort of interesting new type of approach to logic, which deals with paradoxes, right? So this idea that typical classical paradoxes which when they're stated in classical logic, which of course has only two modalities, yes or no, true or false, then you come up with these paradoxes where the answer doesn't seem to be either yes or no.
Right.
So you have the liar's paradox, things like that.
Yeah.
Well, one way to deal with it, with this, according to some modern logicians, including some colleagues actually at CUNY Graduate Center that I have, is to actually bite the bullet and say, okay, well, we create a new type of logical system that actually has not just two possible answers, two possible modes, but it has both or neither, for instance.
Yeah.
And it turns out that once you do that, then all sorts of interesting properties come out of these kinds of systems. Now, there's no sense in which this is a reaction to a problem posed by the outside world.
Yeah.
The paradoxes are themselves, results of human imagination. We think about liar's paradox. It's not out there in any physical system that I'm aware of. So, in that sense, I think that both logic and mathematics do respond largely to internally generated problems. Now, there is, of course, the obvious observation that yes, but then it turns out that from time to time, both logic and mathematics have incredibly stunning applications to the real world. right? I mean, obviously, mathematics is useful to science, to natural science, and logic is used both in the natural sciences and, of course, in computer science, right? But that's, I think, a different question. That is a question of mapping domains. So I think we have two significantly distinct approaches to different kinds of problems, the natural sciences, in particular physics on the one hand, and logic and mathematics on the other. And then it turns out that there is an interesting subset of the problems of the latter, of logic and mathematics, that actually maps very nicely with the problems of the former, with the problems of natural science. And of course, that's, the answer to why that is the case depends on whether you are a mathematical Platonist or not. It depends on, the concept of evocation that I use in the book, as you know. And
which
so
we haven't got, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. Yeah. Let me ask you, just while we're on this, and I guess I don't expect that the two definitions are going to perfectly neatly fit the sciences on the one hand, and we already saw with the sciences. You said that there's ways you might look at the sciences in which they satisfy the second definition, and I'm wondering with respect to the latter whether there's ways in which they also satisfy the first. So here's what I have in mind. Now maybe I'm wrong about this. I mean, I certainly know a lot less about science than you or probably most people, but I was under the impression that part of the motivation, the impetus for the development of non-Euclidean geometries was relativistic physics. And I was also under the impression that some of the motivation for developing multivalent logics was because of quantum mechanics. Is that not the case?
Yeah, so historically it's not quite actually that clear cut. It's certainly the case that non-Euclidean geometries have been used and have a huge application in relativity. It's also the case that non-classical logics have used in quantum mechanics. But actually, quantum mechanics, I think the case of quantum mechanics is more clear. Non-classical logics are still insufficient to deal with quantum mechanical phenomena.
Okay.
They were developed before quantum mechanics or independently of quantum mechanics toward the end of the 19th century. It is true, however, that logicians are in fact working on basically quantum kind of logics, which are inspired by actual world, empirical data. But I think of that as simply a recurrence of what happened at the beginning of these fields, where plane geometry was inspired by the fact that people had to divide up their fields in some way, and they invented that. But then after that, all sorts of interesting properties that, like the Euclidean theorem and all that sort of stuff, the whole of Euclidean geometry expanded very quickly, beyond what was actually necessary for practical purposes.
Yeah, I see the way in which it generates its own problems once it gets going, but I just was sort of wondering whether it also does piggyback on the kind of progress that science makes. I mean, we find out from Einstein that space doesn't consist of Euclidean planes. Space is actually curved and malleable. Well, now we have to chuck all these geometrical axioms that we used to hold, right? And in that sense, it looks like it's almost a posteriori, right? To a certain degree, right?
Right. I can see what you're saying, but notice the difference. So even though there is debate about this, I think it is fairly clear to me that even after general relativity, let's say, right, it doesn't make any sense to say that, let's say, Euclidean geometry is quote unquote wrong. Euclidean geometry just is.
Right. It's true of the space it imagines. It's just that's not the space that we actually live in. Right.
Exactly. So what you can say is right or wrong. You can say actually that it's useful or not useful, and it turns out actually that Euclidean geometry is still very much useful for all sorts of practical applications that don't involve, relativistic situations. It is also true that non-Euclidean geometries are, useful for other things. But it wouldn't make any sense to say, well, is it Euclidean geometries or non-Euclidean geometries that are true? Well, what does that mean?
Right.
The question you can ask is, are they consistent? Are they interestingly developed? Are they, complex? Are they elegant? You can ask all sorts of those questions, but you cannot ask whether they're true or not. On the other hand, in the natural sciences, you can ask whether it is true that the planets go around the sun or the other way around.
Right.
There is an actual answer to that, and that's the end of the story. It's not it depends.
Right. So we have this distinction between the two kinds of progress. Forward or onward movement towards a destination, advancements toward a better, more complete or modern condition. we've roughly sorted the natural sciences as progressing in the first sense, logic and mathematics, we're leaving philosophy out for a second, in the second sense,
Right.
with the acknowledgement that this isn't perfectly airtight. And I gather that the reason for this sorting, the reason why the sciences fulfill the first sort of progress and the logic and mathematics the second, is because of the kinds of facts that they deal with. And so you then make this further distinction between sort of what I would characterize as discoverable facts, right, about the world, as opposed to what you want to call evoked facts. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see that distinction and how that then determines why the sciences progress in this way and logic and mathematics progress in the second way.
Right. So this is not my invention. This is actually Lee Smolland's contribution. He's a physicist, a theoretical physicist, who, however, is very much interested in philosophical issues, particularly as it pertains to the nature of time. And so he wrote this book that we talked about probably in the past.
We have, yeah.
With philosopher Unger, and about the nature of time. And at some point, Smolin approaches the issue of mathematical Platonism, right? Because he has a reason for that. I mean, it's not just because he's curious. It's because let's step back for a second, because I actually do think this is not just pertinent to my project, but it's also sort of inherently interesting. So Smolin's project basically is outside of the mainstream of physics at the moment, and it is that he doesn't buy into the Einsteinian view of the world that time is just another dimension of space-time, which is what the equations of general relativity actually tell you, right? And the reason he doesn't buy that, well, there's a number of reasons. Well, one of the reasons is because if that were the case, then you would have to be able to move back and forth in time just in the same way in which you're moving back and forth in space, because from a point of view of the equations of general relativity, and in fact, from the point of view of the equations of quantum mechanics, there is no direction of time. There's no, the equations are completely neutral in that sense. But Smolin says, yeah, but time exists. We got to deal with it. Tough. If Einstein says, it cannot deal with it, that just means that general relativity is incomplete. It's not wrong, it's just incomplete. And so he wants to build a different understanding of time. Now, in order to do that, he has to attack what he sees as the widespread mathematical Platonism or dependence on mathematics than physics has today. Right? It's clear, and nobody doubts that mathematics is incredibly useful for physics. But basically, Smolin is arguing that the physicists got a little too complacent with mathematics, so that if math tells them something like time has two directions, they are actually willing to drop the empirical data, which show that clearly time doesn't have two directions. It flows in one direction only. They drop the empirical data and basically bow to the power of mathematics, right? So now, in order to reject that, he has to come up with some kind of argument against mathematical Platonism, or against buying into these universal truth that somehow supersede physical truths. And the way he does that
is the reason why he has to go, because this is not obvious. The reason why, in order to do what he wants to do, he has to go after mathematical Platonism is because mathematical Platonism represents mathematics as being factual in a way that it really isn't, right?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
Go on then, next. Yes, please.
Thank you. That's
yes.
Right. That bit was missing.
Yeah.
So that's right. Now, but in order to do that, he has to provide some kind of different account
of fact, different kinds of facts. Yeah.
Facts, right? Now, the typical accounts, the two major accounts, broadly speaking, I mean, there's a number of them, but they fall into two categories. The two philosophical accounts of, if you want, the two metaphysical accounts of mathematics. One is Platonism, according to which mathematical facts are real, as in they are mind independent. The Pythagorean theorem or the last Fermat's theorem, they are actually true regardless of whether anybody can think that they're true, right? Now, to most people that seems weird. It's like, what do you mean? Those are, it's not. It's almost like treating mathematical objects as if they really were planets and stars and galaxies and things like that, right? Those are clearly mind independent, unless you're an idealist. So mathematical Platonism tends to move mathematics into that direction. And that's, in Smolin's view, that's a problem, because it leads to that kind of issues that we talked about a minute ago. The other approach is sort of a constructivist approach in mathematics, or a nominalist approach in mathematics, and basically says, no, look, mathematics is just a human invention, and it's completely arbitrary, and it wouldn't exist outside of human minds or similar kinds of minds, and therefore there's no fact of the matter, there's no truth out there to be sought in terms of mathematics. It's just a tool. It turns out to be useful for certain kinds of things we do, but that's about it. Smolin, I think, is right, regardless of whether one thinks that his particular answer, to which we'll get in a minute, is in fact on the right track or not. But I think that he's right in rejecting both of those.
Yeah, the second seems far too strong. Also, I mean, it's strong in the other direction. Yeah.
And then this is a problem. This is an issue that in the philosophy of mathematics has been going on for a long time, because there are actually fairly strong arguments, but also very large weaknesses on both camps, right? So the mathematical Platonists will say, well, how else would you explain the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics? I mean, it's like it would be a miracle if there were no mathematical facts, and all of a sudden you find out that mathematicians have been going on for decades, sometimes centuries, working in a certain direction, and then it turns out that, oh gosh, the universe is actually made like that.
Right.
Like, wow, what a coincidence! Now, if it happens one, maybe it's a coincidence, but the history of
it works a lot. It works.
It happens a lot. So, once it's a coincidence, two, you gotta start thinking about it. If it is hundreds of times, they say, okay, this can't be anything other than a miracle. So that's one of the main arguments by mathematical Platonists. But the arguments on the other side, on the sort of nominalist side, is like, okay, dude, but now you are actually conjuring up some really weird ontology of these mathematical objects, and you don't have an explanation of how we have access to that realm, separate realm of mathematics. I mean, we know how we have access, we gain access, as imperfect as it is, to the physical world. We have the five senses. Actually, recently, people have been arguing that we have a lot more than five senses, but whatever, the senses that we have, and then we augment those senses by way of sophisticated, scientific instrumentation. But what the hell do you think mathematics? How do we get access to this realm out there? So those are both good arguments. It kind of sort of basically cancel each other out and say, okay, so now we got something weird. We got good arguments and bad big holes on both sides. So what Smolin came up with was, well, wait a minute. There are actually other categories. There are other possibilities. He says, in fact, there are two other possibilities other than Platonism and sort of nominalism. One is what he calls fictional situations, and then another one is these evoked situation. Okay, so there are certain things that we really, truly seem to make up out of whole cloth. Like one of my favorite, fictional characters, Sherlock Holmes. It's not out there. Nobody would presumably be Platonist about Sherlock Holmes. It's it's a particular invention of a particular human mind.
Although I hate to disappoint you, but I mean, there is quite a number of theories and aesthetics of both of ontology, and for example, literary objects are often treated platonically, as are musical compositions, precisely because they're repeatable in a way that a painting is not, right? So a painting is taken as a concrete object, but if I burn all the copies of Sound and the Fury, I haven't destroyed Sound and the Fury, the novel, right? In other words, it can be reproduced, right?
That's right.
And I can perform Shakespeare's The Tempest in 5 different places. 5 different people can perform the same play. So I'm not suggesting that the Platonist view is correct, but I'm saying it's not a crazy view in the ontology of some of the fine arts, is what I'm saying.
It's not an indefensible view. I still think it's close.
No, I don't think it's right either. But But it is hard to explain how a fictional object is different from, let's say, a painting, without invoking something like that.
Agreed. Yeah, but let's stick for a second with Smolin's distinction.
That's fine.
Well, look, Sherlock Holmes did not exist before Conan Doyle thought about it.
Agreed.
And in fact, if we wiped out entirely not only all of the books about Sherlock Holmes, but all the hard drives and all the memories of anything, the theater performance and everything. Well, then it's arguable that Sherlock Holmes will never exist again, because it will be very hard to imagine somebody will come up with exactly the sort of same kind of characteristics. So it's it's a true invention of the human mind. But Smolin says there are other things that just don't seem to fit like that. Take, for instance, a game like chess, right? Now, chess, of course, in some sense is an invention of the human mind. I mean, the rules are arbitrary, right? But those rules, once that they're put into place, once that they're arbitrarily put into place by a human being or a number of human beings, they constrain the system, in this particular case, the game, in a way that is nowhere even close to the way in which Conan Doyle constrained Sherlock Holmes. You can do almost whatever you like with Sherlock Holmes. Not quite, because it still has to be a detective, I suppose, and still sort of be in London and whatever it is. But the canon, the non-official canon of Sherlock Holmes stories, shows you just how flexible this thing is. You can move it to contemporary London, as it's been done with the Benedict Cumberbatch BBC series. You can move it back in time, but in a completely different manner, like the Robert Downey Jr. movies. You can do all sorts of stuff and still call it Sherlock Holmes. People will recognize it as Sherlock Holmes, but there are really very few constraints on how you do that. On the other hand, once you set down the rules of chess, not only what you can do with those rules is highly constrained. I mean, you cannot move the king by 2 steps. That's it, end of story, because that's a violation of the rules. You have to change the rules if you want to do that. But if you stay within the rules, you can't do that. But more importantly, once the rules are set, you can actually demonstrate mathematical, logical theorems about chess that you simply cannot imagine demonstrating for a fictional character like Sherlock Holmes, right?
Okay.
So the idea, and he calls, and Smolin calls these things, these properties evoked, meaning that they are initially arbitrary. You start with axioms, with assumptions that are arbitrary, but once they are evoked, once they're put in place, they really highly constrain the system in very specific ways. And the idea that he proposes is the mathematics is evoked. It's neither Platonic, it's neither the result of Platonism, the search for Platonic forms, nor is it constructed, in an anomalist fashion. It is evoked in this sense. The axioms are arbitrary, sure, but once you get those axioms down, let's take Euclidean geometry, right? Once you get those axioms down, you can demonstrate all sorts of other things that rigorously and inevitably, because that's the key word here, both rigorously and inevitably follow from those axioms. Now, you could say, but I can change the axioms. Sure, in which case you're going to be able to demonstrate other things that also, and that's what happened when you move from Euclidean geometry to non-Euclidean geometry, right? You change some of the axioms, you drop some of the axioms, you introduce new ones, and now what you get, the result, the game, so to speak, that you get, it's a wholly different game, but it's also highly constrained, and there are also all sorts of interesting properties that can be rigorously demonstrated about that system.
Okay, I'm going to push on this a little bit, not much, but a little bit, because to push on it too much is going to take us off the track, and I want to work through the book as you wrote it, but I do want to push on this a little bit. The examples you gave strike me as I wonder whether it doesn't have more to do with whether canons are enforced or not. In other words, you came up with the example of Sherlock Holmes. I'll come up with another example, Star Trek. Now there, the canons are very rigorously enforced to the point to which if you try to write a Star Trek novel and submit it to the publisher, it's got to go through a canonicity process that ensures that it doesn't violate the internal rules of Star Trek. There are developments within the Star Trek universe that are rule governed. For example, there are languages that people learn and speak. You can speak Klingon incorrectly, right? You can't just speak it any way you want. Similarly, on the other side, with, let's say, games like chess or like baseball, these games are governed by bodies that do have the ability to change the rules of the game, and indeed the games have not remained the same over time. And so I guess I'm not really seeing the kind difference What I'm seeing is a difference that depends mostly upon the extent to which whatever the governing bodies are decide to enforce canonicity or not. Could you explain maybe a little more deeply the difference that you see, given that fact?
Yeah, those are very good examples. But I do think that Smolin's distinction is resistant to those kind of counterexamples in this sense. Look, first of all, this is a discussion that we have, especially on my blog, as you know, on Plato's Footnote, with other people a lot. Whenever I want to make distinctions, somebody wants to make, to say, well, it's all the same stuff. And I'm not wedded.
I hope I'm not just doing that.
No, you're not. But what I want to say is I'm not wedded to sharp distinctions that is, okay, here's category 1 over here, category 2 over there. As far as I'm concerned, in fact, that's the idea. The metaphor that I pursue in the rest of the book is one of a landscape with a number of peaks that sort of grade into each other, right? A number of intellectual peaks, if you like, that grade into each other. So if we want to say, look, there is no clear-cut, sharp distinction between evoked systems and just invented systems, I'm okay with that. As long as we agree, however, that there is enough of a distinction that really chess is in fact different even from Star Trek. And let me tell you, let me try to explain why. So it is true that there is a body of governance of Star Trek or whatever it is that does or does not allow certain things to happen. But what that body allows, it's largely a matter of the taste of that body. Like for instance, in one of the recent Star Trek movies, all of a sudden we wiped out the original universe by essentially destroying Vulcan.
Yeah,
and that's it, right?
Yeah.
So now I can imagine people sitting down when this was proposed and say, okay, are we going to do this or are we not going to do this? And that choice was purely a matter of taste. There wasn't any constraint imposed by the system that said, oh, no, you absolutely cannot do that sort of thing. On the other hand, if you want to show that a certain, let's say the Pythagorean system is wrong, right? We really have to change the axioms. You cannot do it from within the system.
I agree with that. But if I want to add a designated hitter rule to baseball for the American League,
you can do that.
But how is that different from what the Star Trek people do?
Well, I think it's more similar to what the mathematicians do, because you can add an axiom, let's say, to a system, or logicians do. You can add, in fact, in the book at some point, I show what I thought was really interesting logical connections, so to speak, metalogical connections between different types of logic. You can, as it turns out, once you get into multimodal logic, you can derive all sorts of interesting additional logics like the ontic logic and so on and so forth by just adding one or another axiom. And somebody, I forgot the name of the author, actually came up with this diagram that's published in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that actually shows all these connections. Now, those connections to me are things like, to use Dan Dan's phrase, the difference between chess and schmess, right? Schmess is just like chess, but the king does move by two squares. You're changing the rules, or like your example of baseball, right? So you're changing the rules, but once you change the rules, of course, there are different things you can do, and there are other things that maybe you were able to do before and you cannot do anymore. But the point is that it's a question of just how rigid the system is. Sports, by the way, is interesting that Smolin didn't pick sports as an example.
Because you think that's kind of in between. It's nebulous.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, because the baseball example sounds a lot like the Star Trek example and less like the Euclidean geometry example. Let me ask you one more thing, and I think probably we'll have to draw because I know you have to go out to dinner. And it's actually a good place for us to stop because then we'll start in on philosophy next time. The last thing I want to ask is, okay, let's say I accept this notion of evocation, right? So we have a distinction between discoverable facts and evoked facts. And let's leave out invention for the sake of simplicity. The whole idea, part of the idea was supposed to be that, well, we want to get away from mathematical Platonism because it gives a kind of a factuality to mathematics that it doesn't have, and then science gets led around by the nose by the mathematicians and gets into all sorts of weirdness that then is untestable, like string theory. But we don't want to be fictionalist about it because then we can't explain why the hell mathematics is so successful and useful. I don't understand. Maybe you can explain how the evocation treatment of mathematics helps in that regard, because all that the evocation does is suggest that there are certain kinds of inventions that then become rule governed in a way that they can't just be sort of willy-nilly pulled. But how does that explain? How does the fact that an invention becomes rule governed explain why it maps onto the real world so well?
Right. Now, at that level, we need to abandon the analogy of chess or any other game and just talk about mathematics and logic. And it is a great question. I mean, this is definitely an interesting question for both epistemologists, I think, and metaphysicians. But I think that Smoling's point, with which I agree, is the following. He says, okay, so now what we have is a universe out there which is amenable to empirical investigation, right? That's what science does. And if there is one thing that seems to be true of the universe, is that it's logically coherent. There's nothing in the universe that happens that seems to violate any basic laws of logic. It's a coherent system. It's an understandable system.
That's true with quantum mechanics?
Yes. Once you get into those rules, yes.
Okay, go on.
You have to use certain particular kinds of rules. But even so, it's very consistent. In fact, quantum mechanics is even more consistent, if anything.
Okay, go on.
Because you can make predictions at a very, very high level of precision, right? So it seems like, for whatever reason, which we will leave unaddressed at the moment, the universe itself seems to be logically coherent. It's not. It doesn't emit of incoherences. Now, if that's the case, then Smolin says one can argue that that's why mathematics and or logic are occasionally very useful to science, because the universe as it actually exists is a subset of all possible mathematically coherent universes. If you're a Platonist, like Max Tegmark is, for instance, the mathematician, you would say, aha, therefore all of these other universes exist as well. Right? But if you are into, if you buy the idea of evocation, then you say, no, my friend, what happens is that there is an infinite number of mathematically consistent universes, and one happens to exist. And what distinguishes mathematics from physics is precisely the fact that the business of physics is to find out the one, that one. And there's no way to find out that one just doing mathematics, because mathematics, in a sense, the way that I to conceptualize it for myself is that mathematics massively underdetermines physics. Right? So, as you know, in philosophy of science, there's this idea that scientific theories themselves, sometimes at least, underdetermine the empirical evidence, meaning that empirical evidence is compatible with more than one idea, right? Or one theory. When in which case, you only have two options. Either you are at least provisionally agnostic about which theory is going to be the correct one, or you're going to wait until you're going to seek
until more evidence comes to distinguish one from the other, because it's not an indeterminacy situation; it's an underdetermination situation.
Exactly, it's an underdetermination. Right. Now, the idea here that Smolin has is that logic and mathematics massively underdetermine the world as it is, because there is only one universe. He doesn't believe in the multiverse. He says that's metaphysical speculation. In fact, that's one of his examples.
The result of mathematics having excessive influence over philosophy, over science. Yeah.
Now, he doesn't say, of course, we know that there is no such thing as a multiverse. He just says that's not a scientific idea, because you got there by way of mathematics.
Right. And all that mathematics does is describe these possible logical spaces. But there's a lot of possible logical spaces, and there's only one actual world, right?
Exactly. There is even though there are logical spaces that are incoherent, and therefore they cannot physically exist, assuming the axiom that I mentioned a minute ago, that the actual universe is in fact mathematically and logically coherent. Let's assume that for a second, right? If you assume that, it is true that there is an infinite number of universes that cannot exist because they would involve mathematical or physical, or logical inconsistencies. But there is still an infinite number of universes that could exist, because of course there are different degrees of infinities, different ranks of infinities, and the business of science is to go after only one.
But if this is what I still don't understand, and I'm wondering whether there has to be some sort of I mean, each of those mathematical possibilities is evoked, right? And
Yes.
so, how does evocation explain the matching of any of them with the actual world? In other words, if evocation starts just like fiction does, and is
Yeah.
distinguished from fiction only by the fact that rules then emerge,
Right.
then I don't understand why evocation in mathematics or logic explains why it fits the world so well in this particular case.
Let me go back to chess at this point. So I think that it may be misleading, and maybe I wrote it that way, and so it's my fault. But it may be misleading to say that it's about one has rules and the other one doesn't have rules. It's about the rigidity resulting from those rules, because as you pointed out, in the case of Star Trek, there are rules, quote unquote, meaning there are things that fans agree and writers agree to respect, and those are in fact rules, right? But those rules are not rigid. They don't determine in a rigid way what happens to the system. The rules of chess, on the other hand, unless you change them, are in fact rigid. So the example to answer your question would be this: there is an infinite number of configurations of chess pieces, chess games. There's an infinite number of chess games that you can possibly play, or very, very, very high number of chess games you can play. But if you want to understand a particular game, let's say that you want to understand, the game that was played last year in the final of the World Championship, then that game represents reality as it actually occurred, right? Those two players didn't play any of the other really, really, really large number of games. They played that one. But the reason you understand what happened, and you can actually describe it, you can even explain why one player lost and the other one won, why a particular move was a good move and turns out to be a winning one, and so on and so forth, is because those things are derived in a rigid way from the system of rules. But the system of rules massively underdetermines that particular game. So in the analogy there, and of course, like all analogies, it's imperfect, right? But the analogy that I'm trying to draw here is the rules of chess as equivalent to all the axioms in mathematics, and a particular game of chess that actually happened as equivalent to the particular universe that actually exists. In both cases, there is a massive underdetermination of one by the other. And you can say, oh no, it wasn't just that particular game that was played. Infinite number of games were played, and we just happened to observe this one. And that would be weird. Right?
Yeah, but isn't it the case that if there are infinitely many possible fictions, right? Now, presumably, one of those possible fictions is going to be a literal description of the world that we live in, right? So in other words, rigidity of rules seems to be an internal property, like coherence. I don't see how that connects you to the world in any particular way.
Well, what you just actually proposed is similar to the famous short story by Jorge Luis Borges, The Library.
Yeah.
So maybe we should actually link to the
yeah, that's wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, it's a really fun story, right? And so the idea, of course, is that there's this library where it contains all possible books written with certain rules. Actually, if I remember correctly, that were written in a particular language or were a particular, with certain alphabets or a certain grammar. But given those very loose constraints, let's say English and the characters of the English language, the rules of the English language, you can write an infinite number of books. Most of them are going to be complete gibberish.
Right.
They're going to be z.
Right.
But at least one is going to actually, or possibly one, it's going to actually give you a precise description of all past history and all future history. And of course, in the short story, there are all these people who waste their entire lives trying to find the video, which of course there's no way to tell which one it is,
right?
Because it could be different from the actual. The one you're reading may be very accurate, except for a very crucial detail.
Yeah, there's one fewer hair on your head than you actually have, right?
Now, the way I understand, in fact, I actually thought in the past of this was before reading Smalling. I thought in the past of Borges' Library as a reasonable way to solve the conundrum of mathematical Platonism. That is, to treat language as a sufficiently rigid system. It's not as rigid as mathematics, because languages, of course, evolve naturally,
Yeah.
and they don't have a logical coherence that you find in mathematical system or systems or logical systems. But nonetheless, they're rigid enough systems that you can actually use them, of course, as descriptions of the real world.
Yeah.
That's how science got started, right? And so if that's the case, yes, there will be one book in the library that does describe the real world. Now, what I would say then is that natural language, again, similarly to mathematics, massively underdetermines the actual physical universe. And that is because of very similar reasons. That is, it is a coherent system. I mean, we try to use language. I mean, even natural language has a high degree of logical coherence.
Yeah.
And because otherwise we couldn't use it. I mean, language. Let's go back to the beginning. I mean, people there are all sorts of weird sort of theories about how language arose and why language arose. But one thing we can be reasonably sure about is that it arose as a way of communicating things about the world. And that is why languages tend to be somewhat, at least, logically coherent, because the world itself is logically coherent. And you cannot use a system, you cannot describe the system that is logically coherent using a tool that it's got nothing to do with logic. Right. So I think that your example is a good one, the language one. But I do think that language is, in some sense, a sort of borderline or intermediate situation, precisely because it is constraining. It's not as constraining as mathematics or logic or the rules of chess, but it is constraining enough that you can, in fact, say, and reasonably so, that but if I write enough random books and put them into Borges' library, one of them will actually be the final theory of everything. And yeah, that's true.
But would you then want to say that book is not invented but evoked?
Well, it's...
I mean, the reason I brought up the example was that these are really, in a sense, you're writing fictions, and one of them happens to be true. And I was trying to sort of push on this distinction between evocation and invention, right?
But notice that in order to do that, you had to move. I mean, I appreciate the point, but in order to do that, you had to move to the level of the whole language, right? So I think that one can say, yes, that is actually evoked, because now you're using the full language, the whole language, as your starting point. On the other hand, individual authors, like Conan Doyle or the authors of Star Trek, are working within the language.
Yeah.
And they're working very locally, and so they're much less determined. The system is much less constrained.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, I think this is a good first chunk, and I think we're nicely set up to start with philosophy next time.
Oh, that's right.
Where philosophy fits into the map, why you think it fits into the map in these areas, and then we can continue forward from there.
So next time, what philosophy actually is.
Yeah, and will you still be in Rome the next time, or are you going to already be back the next time we do this?
I'll be in Rome for another month and a half, so we'll probably do it the same way.
Okay, that's great. Massimo, I hope you feel better.
Thank you.
Please once again thank your brother for his hospitality, and enjoy your dinner.
Thanks very much.
All right, take care, my friend.
Bye.